So geometric sequences. Does anyone remember what another name for geometric sequences are? Anybody? What was that? Say it louder. Exponential. And if you remember, exponential functions had the x in the exponent, right? Now, this right here is the other way of writing it. We would say f of x is equal to the first term times whatever our r value is to the x minus 1. Whereas f of 1 is the first term in the sequence, x is the common, or is the current term number, and r is the common ratio. In other words, the number that is being multiplied each time. Okay? Some important things that you need to note here. Two important things that people often lose points on. Number one, do not multiply your first term times your ratio. And I'll ask you that question, or I'll ask you about that question when we get to an example. Do not multiply the first term times your ratio. Has to do with PEMDAS. If you can't simplify an exponent, you cannot move on to multiplication. Also, people will often say, how do you find your R value? You take a term and you divide it by the term in front of it. Okay, that's how we found out about exponential equations or exponential functions when we learned about it last semester. So, first two problems. Determine if the sequence is geometric. Then if it is, find R and write the next two terms. Here's how I determine if it's geometric. I start off with the second term. I make it in a fraction over the first term. 2 over 1. Term 2 over term 1. I also have to make a fraction with 18 over 6. I have to make as many fractions as I possibly can out of what they've given me. If these all reduce to the same thing, then guess what? It's geometric, and I've found my R value. So what is 6 over 2 reduced to? 18 over 6. Since those are the same, yes, it is geometric. My R value is equal to what? 3. In other words, that's what they're multiplying by each time. And you might see that from right here. 2 times 3 is 6, times 3 is 18. You might see that. Sometimes it's not as easy to see, in which case these fractions become really important. Okay? Let's see. The next two terms, what would the fourth term be? How would I find it? 18 times 3. Get my calculator. 18 times 3, is that 54? Yep. So let's see, this would be 54. And what would the next term be? 54 times 3, 162. So? Is the next one geometric? It's dividing. Is dividing a way of multiplying something? Interesting question. Is dividing a way of multiplying something? Multiplying by a fraction. Yeah. So let's see. What would my first fraction be? 125 over 625. What would my next fraction be? 25 over 125. And my next fraction? 5 over 25. I need to reduce all those. 5 over 25 I know reduces to 1/5. Does 25 over 125 reduce to 1/5? And let's just check. 125 over 625. Look at that, it reduces to 1/5. So is this one geometric? Now, is it important that you do the second term over the first term instead of the first term over the second term? Absolutely. Because if you did the opposite, if you did 625 over 125, you would come up with an R value of 5. And it is not multiplying by 5 each time. It's dividing by 5, which means my R value is not 5, it is 1/5. So, let's see. If I am multiplying by 1/5, what is 5 times 1/5? 1. My next term is 1. What is 1 times 1/5? And that's my next term. Okay? Kind of get it? So that's how you determine if it's geometric. That's the first part of your quiz, right? Determine if it's arithmetic or geometric. Little hint there. If your only two options are arithmetic or geometric, if it's not arithmetic, then it is geometric by... Anyways. Okay. Now let's do these guys. It says find the common ratio. That statement tells me that this is geometric. Right? If it says find the common ratio, the only way it can have a common ratio is if it's geometric. So they're telling me it's geometric without actually saying it's geometric. So I don't have to set up several fractions because the several fractions proves it's geometric. I don't need to prove it's geometric. So I just need to set up one fraction to get my common ratio. So let's set up one fraction. What would one fraction be? 2.31 over 2.1. Now, oftentimes, let's see if my calculator likes this. Oftentimes, our calculators do not like fractions in decimals. Hey, look at that. It does. Mine does. If it doesn't like a fraction with decimals in it, just type in 2.31 divided by 2.1. Because we're going to go ahead and go to the decimal form anyways. Why would we go to the decimal form when that fraction was reasonable? Because they're giving me decimals in the problem. So let's stick with decimals. So what's my R value? 1.1. And again, why do I only need to do one fraction for my R value this time? I'm not trying to prove that it's geometric. They've already told me that. So I'm just trying to come up with my R value. So there's my R value. So I found the common ratio. Now I need to write my explicit formula. You ready? This is terribly difficult. My explicit formula is the first term. What's the first term? That's how our explicit formula for arithmetic started, right? Except this time I'm not going to put plus D. I'm going to put my R value in parentheses. What's my R value? And then my exponent is x minus 1. There is no simplifying like there was on the arithmetic. Remember arithmetic, you had to distribute and combine like terms? We're done here. That's my explicit formula. Can you do that on your quiz tomorrow? Yeah? What's the last thing I have to do? Find term 7. So f of 7 would be equal to 2.1 times 1.1 to the 7 minus 1. 2.1 times 1.1 to the 7 minus 1, which is 6, right? And I get 3.720 blah, blah, blah. We'll call it 3.72. Would be the seventh term. Technically, the seventh term would be 3.7202781. I'm just rounding it off because I don't want to write the whole thing. Pretty easy? Okay. Let's try this one. Find the common ratio, an explicit formula, and term 10. This would be f of x, and this would be f of 10. So how would I find my common ratio? 4/3 divided by 2. I'm going to go ahead and do that on my calculator. Why not? 4/3 divided by 2. And it gives me a fraction. Should I stick with fraction or a decimal here? Fraction. Why fraction? They're giving me fractions. We continue speaking their language. So I get an R value of 2/3. So that's step 1, check. Step 2, find my explicit formula. What's my explicit formula? F of x equals 2 times 2/3 to the, there's my formula. Last thing I have to do, find f of 10, would be 2 times 2/3 to the 10 minus 1, which is 9, right? 2 times 2/3 to the 10 minus 1. If you are putting, by the way, I should be using my pink calculator, but I don't know where it is off the top of my head. If you are plugging in 10 minus 1 and your calculator does not go automatically to superscript, make sure you're putting that 10 minus 1 in parentheses. Okay? And there is an ugly term, but 1024 over 19,683. And why would I leave it as an ugly fraction instead of going to decimal? Because they're giving me fractions. Darn those fractions. So? All right, last problemo. Given a sub 5, or in other words, f of 5, equals 54, and an r value of 3, find the explicit formula. Now let me step back for a minute. What are the two pieces of information I need for an explicit formula? I need r, and I need what? The first term. So they've given me r, they have not given me the first term. Right? So this is where I take this and I write it as an ordered pair. That's my x value and my y value. You remember that? And I have to plug that into my formula. So if my formula is y equals, we'll say f of 1, or the first term, times r, which I know is 3 to the x minus 1, I have to plug in 54 for y and 5 for x. So 54 equals the first term times 3 to the what? 5 minus 1? Do you follow? 54 equals, that's 3 to the 4th, correct? 3 to the 5 minus 1 is 3 to the 4th, which is 81. So I have 81 times f of x. I just reversed those orders. How would I get, I'm sorry, f of 1, not f of x. How would I get f of 1 then? Divide by 81. F of 1 equals, what is 54 over 81? Now, do I do decimal or fraction? They don't give me, do they? They don't give me decimals or fractions? Then if you can, use fractions because they're more accurate. 2/3, if I wrote that as a decimal, I would have to round off. I don't want to have to round off. So let's just call it 2/3. So I have my first term now, and I have my r value. What's my explicit formula? F of x equals 2/3 times what? 3 to the x minus 1. Easy peasy? All right, let me double check your homework. I think you should be you should understand your homework, no problemo. All right, remember, quiz tomorrow. Happy studying.